Hey everyone, we've been having really great weather this spring, so I've jumped off of all my other projects and I've been pouring my time into restoring this old stone barn. So this is a traditional fieldstone and lime barn, and it's probably between 200 and 250 years old, and it needs a lot of work. One of the main things I've been doing on it, and it needs desperately, is repointing. So these old barns are made with a lime-based mortar, which has been around for at least 2,000 years. The Romans used it a lot, and it's always been one of the more popular traditional mortars here in Britain. It's basically made by crushing up limestone and burning that in a kiln, and then slaking that with a bit of water to make the powder that you can then mix with the sand to create your mortar. So lime has been the traditional method to build these stone buildings here in Britain for a really long time. But then just after World War II, cement became really popular. So then from the 40s into the 80s, cement was used to restore a lot of these old buildings. And it took 20 or 30 years to really figure this out, but it was doing a lot of damage to the old stone and to the buildings in general. And then in the 80s, a movement started coming in to eliminate the use of cement on buildings like these and go back to the traditional lime because it's much better for the buildings. And that movement has been growing ever since. And so today you'll see a lot more lime work, which is better for the stone and better for the building overall. So why is lime mortar so much better than cement? And it's actually quite a few different reasons. The first is that lime is a much softer product than cement mortars. So it allows for the building to settle and to move. And in these old buildings, especially with old foundations, you do get quite a bit of movement within the building. And the lime can actually accommodate and shift just a little bit without cracking, whereas the cement is so stiff and strong that it just leads to cracking. So that leads to the second consideration, which is that you always want your mortar to be softer than the stone product you're working with. So in this case, lime is softer than stone, so if there is movement, the cracking will occur in the mortar and leave the stone undamaged. But if this was cement mortar, you'd actually get the stone cracking instead of the mortar, and that can lead to really big long-term problems. Next, the lime is actually quite breathable, whereas the cement is basically waterproof. So as water penetrates into the wall, which is guaranteed to happen over time, the lime actually allows the wall to breathe and to release that moisture. Whereas if this was cement, the water actually gets trapped in the wall, which leads to long-term degradation of both the stone and the mortar. And the water trapped in the wall will also be trying to leave the wall to normalize with the humidity conditions on the exterior and interior of the building. And because cement is so unporous, it can't make its way through the cement. And the stone is actually more porous than the cement. So the water will be driven to try to travel through the stone, and this leads to another set of problems. So first, during freeze-thaw cycles, the water in the stone, if it ever becomes ice and expands, can lead to cracking internally in the stone, and then the water can actually leach minerals out of the stone as it's making its way out, which can lead to staining and reduce strength in the stone. And you can also get salt crystallization, and as the crystals grow, they can crack the stone. So it really does lead to a lot of problems. And then lime is also just a lot more environmentally friendly than cement. So it produces less carbon dioxide during the manufacturing process, and during the curing process, it actually absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere back into the lime mortar. Now I'll get into the actual process. So the first thing I want to do is go through and remove all the old lime. And you can see it's just crumbling away. It's so soft, and it's basically letting water penetrate right in, and it's just not offering any protection and minimal strength to the wall. So the first thing I'll do is just use a pick, and I'll go through and I'll scrape, and I can do a little bit of prying, and then any chipping for tough spots. And I'm trying to go about 2 times as deep as the crack is wide. So if I've got a 1-inch gap, I'm trying to go about 2 inches deep. If I've got a 2-inch crack up here, I'll be trying to go about 4 inches deep. And this is really important so that as you apply the new lime, you can get keyed in really well. It's got enough surface area and depth to make a really good bond to the stone and to add a good layer of strength and protection to the outside of the wall. And as I'm going through this, I'm going to be paying attention for any loose stone that needs to be rebedded in before I finish up the pointing. This can be a really dusty job, and lime dust can really irritate the lungs. So using a good mask is a good idea, and also some safety glasses. Once I've gone through the whole thing with a pick, I'll go over it with a blower and a brush to make sure I've got rid of all the dust and the joints are all prepped. And at that point, I can also do one final glance over it with the pick just to make sure I've got any of the old mortar out that needs to come out. Now that the wall is picked and ready, it's time to make up a batch of the lime mortar. And I'll be using a natural hydraulic lime, which means there's an initial set based on the interaction with the water in the first 2 or 3 days. So you get an initial hardness, and then later on comes the carbonization, which will take a couple months to do, but will further cure the lime. For this, I'm using an NHL 3.5, which is a medium strength lime. It typically comes in 2, 3.5, and 5. And for bedding stone, I'd be using a 5, but for pointing, I'll be using the 3.5, and I'll be mixing it with sharp sand at 2.5 parts sand to 1 part lime. Lime is really alkaline. It's 12 or 13 on the pH scale. And if it gets in your eyes or your lungs, it can cause a chemical burn. It's not super dangerous as long as you take reasonable precautions, but you just don't want to breathe this in or get it in your eyes. And the mixing process is a bit more fickle than when you mix up a batch of cement-based mortar. It really needs to be just right, or you can develop some problems with the curing process or the lifespan of the lime itself. So I'll throw the sand and the lime into the mixer, and I'll just let them dry mix really thoroughly and get incorporated all the way. Then I'll start really slowly adding water. One of the biggest issues you can run into is adding too much water, and it's tricky because it makes it look like it wants more water, but it doesn't. You just need to be patient. I'll zoom in to show you while I'm doing this, but as I slowly start to add the water, it'll start to incorporate, and it'll go through several stages of hydration. And once it hits a point where it's making little balls, tons of little balls, we're really close, and we want to add just a tiny bit more water to get right past the balling phase. And at this point, it's still going to look too dry if you're used to mixing cement mortars. If you don't get just past the balling effect, what happens is those balls start to harden and they never further incorporate with the rest of the mix, and it just ends up with a lot of discard from that batch. And we're just about there. When it starts to cascade like a wave, and the balls are almost gone, we're just about there. Now there's a couple reasons you don't want to add too much water. First, for workability, if it's too wet, it'll slump and it won't want to stick in the cracks very well, and it'll droop out as you're applying it. And if there's too much water, as it starts to dry out, it'll begin to shrink, and this will lead to a less strong cure and also cracking as it shrinks. Okay, so the balls are mostly broken up now, and here's where we just let it run for another 20 minutes to really fully incorporate all the water. It's going to look like a stiff peanut butter consistency, which is right where you want to be. So it's been about 15 minutes and it's starting to look really good. I'm just going to go through and scrape off the edges just to make sure that all this stuff gets further incorporated, and then run it for about 5 more minutes. And then you want to just let it sit for another 10 or 15 minutes, and this is called fattening up. And basically, the lime powder is absorbing a bit more of the water. It's going to be smoother and less gritty, and it's going to be much more workable when you actually go to apply it. So the mix is sitting to fatten up now, and I'll do the last bit of prep. With hydraulic lime, you want the initial hydraulic setting phase, which is a few days to maybe a week long, to be as slow as possible, and it needs to stay damp in order to do that. So I'm going to be pointing on this side of the wall. This side is too sunny. It would dry out too fast. By the time I got through a batch, I wouldn't have been able to cover it up. And so I'm always going to be working away from the sun and picking where I'm working on depending on the weather conditions. And then the next thing is I'll go through with a sprayer and I'll just mist all the joints. So if these are bone dry, the stone is actually going to suck the moisture out of the lime on the backside, and then it's going to dry out too quickly. So again, I'm just misting. I don't want to make it so wet that it's really dripping, just enough water so that the stone isn't bone dry and doesn't soak up the water from the lime. This should be ready to go, and I'll go grab a bucket of lime and get pointing. So for pointing, I just like to use a piece of old slate. I've got 290 degrees, and then I've got an acute and an obtuse angle. So this gives me some different options to get into corners and things. And then just a basic pointing trowel. And I keep a bucket next to me, just stick it in, get some lime, and then go right to it. So I always start at the bottom and work my way up, because the lime at the bottom will help support as you work into vertical joints. It'll support the lime building up. I'm just gonna push this right up next to it and start scraping it in. Now, for best practices, you only want to apply the lime about an inch or 25 mil deep. If it gets too deep all at once, not enough carbon dioxide can actually get to the lime to assist in the curing process. So what you can do is go through the whole thing and point all the deeper parts first. Next, I can come back tomorrow and add another layer on top of that. And the reason I don't want to go through and do the shallow joints right now is because you'll get a lot of seams where fresh lime is joining up to lime that has already begun to cure, and it's much more brittle and prone to crack if you do that. So you want your final pass to be the surface layer on the entire thing all at once. So I'm going to just go through and get all the back stuff pointed, then I'll come back and finish it up tomorrow. So here's the wall with all the deep cracks pointed, and I'll just let this set up and come back tomorrow and do the final coat. All right, we're back and it's the next day. So now I'll just go ahead and mist the whole thing, and I'll just load up my slate, and I'll start on a horizontal seam. And I can just put this right up next to it and just start pushing it in. Now, once I get the lime in there, the trick is that I want to key it into the stone. So I want a good amount of pressure, and on each side I'll be scraping toward the stone to push it up in against so that it can actually bond to the stone. Okay, this section's fully pointed, so then the next thing to do is to give it a brush down to get a nice uniform surface texture. The amount of time you wait to do the brushing will vary. If it starts to really set, it's going to be too hard to brush, and if it's still too wet and hasn't set up enough, you can pull it away from the stones. So it takes a little bit of practice to get used to when to brush it, but on a hot sunny day like this, it's probably within an hour or so. And then on a colder cloudy day, it might be that evening that you do it right at the end of the job. So I'll just start down here at the bottom, and one thing I want to try to make sure is that I brush into the stone on each edge. If I pull away coming down, I can pull that away from the stone. I'll try to go along the length and then even up into the stone just to make sure it remains keyed in really well. And if it's started to set off, sometimes I'll just use my thumb to feather in any sharp edges. There's different aesthetics you can try to achieve. When pointing, you can do a recessed joint, you can do a protruding joint, or you can just try to go flush. And with the brushing here, you can go really slow and precise and try to avoid any of this discoloration. I actually think it looks pretty cool, and the lime actually helps prevent growth on the walls. So to me, it's a good idea to kind of get it a little bit everywhere, but really this is just down to aesthetics. On these corner edges, I'll just make sure that they're nice and tucked in, and then I can bring the lime around and feather in a nice edge there. Now that this is all brushed down, I'm going to give it a really quick mist. I would only do this on hot sunny days. It wouldn't need it on a colder cloudy day, and it's really brief. If I add enough moisture that I change the consistency, it can start to slump and actually pull away from the stones, and then you've undone all your work. So this should be just a really quick wetting down. That's it. Drying out too soon is going to create a really brittle lime, so you definitely want to prevent that. So now with that misted, I'm going to take some burlap or hessian and just cover this up. And this will stay on for at least a few days. And what I can actually do is mist the burlap down. And I'll probably remist this once or twice a day for the first 3 or 4 days, as long as it remains sunny and hot. If I got a cloudy day, I could pay less attention to it. So the first hardening off is the hydraulic action, and that will happen over 3 or 4 days up to a week. And in that time period, if I was going to get rain, I would also tarp this, because it would just pull the lime right out if it got too wet. So you want to protect that from the rain and keep it slightly damp, just so that the curing takes as long as possible, which will lead to a much stronger, more durable lime. And if you're expecting frost, just don't point. Frost is really damaging, and so it's better to just wait till later in the year. But if you've gone ahead and done it, you can always try to insulate with a couple layers of burlap and then a tarp on top. But frost is one thing to really avoid. So I've got tons more to do, and I got to stay ahead of the sun, so I'm going to get back to this. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I really love traditional building techniques, and it's really important to share what we all know so that we can keep these things going. Let me know down below if you've got anything to add to the conversation. I'd love to hear it and share more ideas about this kind of stuff. But thanks for watching, and see you again soon.